So we're going to begin. Larry Andre is in the building, and he should be here shortly. So I think the farm bill is on the floor today. I'm handing the rule, and I have two amendments, and it all begins at noon. So I have to. So we got to try to keep to a time schedule here. But good morning, everybody, and thank you for attending this morning's hearing on the dire human rights situation in Sudan and the multiple humanitarian crises besetting the country. I would like to extend a special welcome to the panelists. I want to thank you for your time, for your work, and for your passion for upholding human rights in Sudan and around the world. I'm grateful to lead this commission with my fellow co-chair, Congressman Frank Wolf, who will be joining us shortly. Mr. Wolf is at a markup and will be joining us after he's finished. I would also like to thank Denise Bell and the staff of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for organizing this hearing. It is with great regret that the Commission finds it necessary once again to call a hearing on the Sudanese government's ongoing campaign of massive human rights abuses against its own people in multiple regions of Sudan, in Darfur, in South Kordofan, in Blue Nile, and elsewhere. We cannot turn our attention to Khartoum's continual campaign of criminal and callous human rights abuses without looking at the massive human suffering that they have caused. In Sudan, the two walk hand in hand. Humanitarian crises plague Darfur, South Kordofan, and Blue Nile. Today, over 2.3 million Darfuris are displaced, including nearly 300,000 as refugees in Chad. Many of these refugees have lived in Chad since as early as 2003. These refugee camps are the only home the thousands of children born there have ever known. They may never know their own land, Darfur. In 2007, I visited these immense camps and heard firsthand the stories of death and despair that forced these people into exile. In South Kordofan and Blue Nile, over 1.15 million Sudanese are displaced, and 200,000 more are refugees in South Sudan. In short, displacement and destruction continue unabated in Sudan. 10 years after reports of Arab militias called Janjaweed committing atrocities in Darfur propelled the region into the headlines, state-sponsored abuses continue in Sudan's western region. Deliberate and indiscriminate attacks on civilians by pro-government militias, aerial bombings, razing of villages, and looting and destruction of property and other civilian structures remain widespread. In 2004, the United States Congress called the state-sponsored violence genocide. The International Criminal Court agreed. President Omar al-Bashir is wanted for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes committed in Darfur. In South Kordofan and Blue Nile, aerial bombardments have been the Sudanese government's signature tactic to devastating effect. Bombs hit residential areas, schools and markets, health clinics, and farm fields. Civilians have no protection, they have no warning of these attacks, and are forced to find shelter in caves in the nearby mountains or bush. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights paints a distressing picture of the human rights violations rising to the level of war crimes and crimes against humanity. These airstrikes severely disrupt planting and harvesting, contributing to food insecurity, malnutrition, lack of access to water, and other negative health impacts, and obstruct access to basic services. Children go without school, and villages are emptied of their people. The aerial bombardments, combined with Khartoum's scorched earth ground attacks and deliberate obstruction of humanitarian aid, have led to chronic hunger and conditions conducive to famine. Rebel groups are not without blame. The SPLM North has obstructed aid too and targeted civilians. But the overwhelming number of abuses and crimes are committed by the government of Sudan. The government of Sudan must stop targeting civilians because of their ethnicity or who they voted for or where they live. The situation is complex. There is intercommunal violence and fighting over resources. But at heart lies an authoritarian regime led by President Omar al-Bashir that marginalizes the periphery, turns the state's armed forces against its own people, and wages cyclical campaigns of divide and conquer to ensure that he remains in power. I am passionate about ending the human rights abuses and humanitarian crises in Sudan. I have been arrested 3 times outside the Sudanese embassy here in Washington, D.C., to protest the government of Sudan's actions against its own people, including the genocide that happened in Darfur. In April, Congressman Wolf, Congressman Mike Capuano, and I introduced the Sudan Peace, Security, and Accountability Act. It would create a comprehensive U.S. strategy to end serious human rights violations in Sudan, provide genuine accountability for persons who have committed or assisted in serious human rights violations, and support Sudanese aspirations for democratic reforms. You know, when I first introduced the bill during the last Congress in March of 2012, I referenced the words of outgoing UN humanitarian coordinator for Sudan, Mukesh Kapila, who warned about Khartoum's actions in the Nuba Mountains. Without international intervention, he warned of a return to Darfur-like destruction in the region. A year later, nothing has changed except more Sudanese are displaced, more Sudanese are injured, more Sudanese are hungry and malnourished, and they live in fear or they are killed. The campaigns of armed conflict and deliberate denial of aid everywhere in Sudan devastates the soul, and it is wrong. We must act to end this cycle of violence. These circumstances demand urgent and continuous pressure from those of us who care passionately about human rights. Today's witnesses will bring fresh knowledge from their time on the ground in Sudan and the refugee camps in Chad and South Sudan. They will bring their expertise on how to break this cycle of violence and to end the campaign of human rights abuses. But most of all, we look to them to provide knowledge and means to chart a path toward a comprehensive solution. The United States, the world's champion of human rights, dignity, and freedom, must renew its efforts to forge the path toward a comprehensive peace solution that addresses the conflicts throughout Sudan and ends the massive humanitarian suffering. Let us resolve that what we discuss and learn here today will not go unheeded, and that we will all join together to stop the massive human rights abuses and the human suffering in Darfur, South Kordofan, Blue Nile, and elsewhere in Sudan. Our conscience and their lives demand no less. Having said that, I want to welcome our first panel. Larry Andre, the Director of the Office of the Special Envoy for Sudan and South Sudan, Bureau of African Affairs of the U.S. Department of State, and Nancy E. Lindborg, Assistant Administrator, Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance, the U.S. Agency for International Development. I want to welcome you both. I want to thank you in advance for all the work that you have done on this issue so far, and we welcome your testimony. Mr. Andre, why don't we begin with you?
Thank you, Congressman McGovern. That'll work? Okay. Well, thank you for this opportunity to inform the Commission of the latest developments in Sudan, where widespread human rights abuses and chronic humanitarian crises tragically continue, as you were just saying. At the State Department's Office of the Special Envoy for Sudan and South Sudan, along with our colleagues at the United States Embassy in Khartoum, we strive to achieve the administration's goal of a peaceful, democratic, and increasingly prosperous Sudan. We work with international diplomatic partners and institutions and with Sudanese to resolve Sudan's violent conflicts and to right Sudan's long-standing governance wrongs, to bring about a better future where violent conflicts no longer arise. A definitive end to Sudan's chronic instability and decades of widespread violence requires governance that respects the human rights of all citizens, since Sudan's disrespect for its citizens' rights has been a primary generator of conflict throughout its history. The American people have responded generously to the humanitarian crises provoked by Sudan's conflicts. My colleague from USAID, Nancy Lindborg, will speak in detail about the humanitarian crises and the U.S. response. I will speak to you today about the armed conflicts within Sudan that produce the greatest share of human rights abuses. We continue to press the government of Sudan to enter into good faith negotiations with the armed opposition and to end these conflicts and to grant humanitarian access to the conflict zones. As proven friends of the Sudanese people, the United States calls upon the government of Sudan and the armed opposition to respect the rights of all Sudanese and to end violence against civilians. We emphatically make this point directly to the government of Sudan, which has primary responsibility for its citizens. We demand the same from the armed groups that oppose it. The U.S. government has initiated and supported a series of United Nations Security Council resolutions condemning the government of Sudan's violations of human rights and international law, especially regarding the targeting of its own citizens through both aerial bombardments and indiscriminate ground attacks on Sudanese communities in conflict zones. These attacks have been most recently documented by Amnesty International in its report on Sudan's Blue Nile state. Amnesty International was kind enough to brief my colleagues and I earlier this week on their very well documented study. The American government has taken actions against the government of Sudan in response to its atrocious treatment of its own citizens. Executive orders impose a trade embargo on Sudan and freeze the assets of its government and of those responsible for human rights abuses. At the same time, the United States supports Sudanese who struggle to exercise their fundamental freedoms and achieve a better future for their nation. Earlier this month, I met with leading Sudanese civil society and human rights activists attending a conference in Nairobi, Kenya, on constitution making in Sudan. Their work in the face of extreme repression remains inspiring. We know that more than 200 political detainees remain in custody. We continue to call for their release. We also know that civic space has narrowed over the past year. Civil society organizations face harassment and arbitrary closure, while journalists and newspapers face a campaign of censorship and reprisal. During the 2013 Free the Press campaign, we highlighted the government of Sudan's deliberate efforts to constrict free political space and called for the release of journalists who had been wrongly imprisoned for their work. We will continue to press the Sudanese government to make progress on critical issues of governance, participation, and human rights, which are at the heart of conflict throughout the country. Negotiations are the only means to resolve Sudan's conflicts. Neither the government of Sudan nor its armed opponents have the ability to achieve military victory. While in the region, I spoke with one of the leaders of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement North, which had previously announced its willingness to resume negotiations with the Khartoum government. He reiterated his group's interest in a cessation of hostilities and humanitarian access to the war-affected Sudanese citizens, followed by a political settlement involving all political parties, civil society, traditional and religious leaders. As he told me, it cannot be only us with guns who settle our nation's future. This is an important message, one that the government of Sudan should take seriously. The United States government works closely with the African Union, the United Nations, international diplomatic partners, and regional states to achieve two aims: ending the current violent conflicts and establishing governance that respects citizens' rights. Positive results on these fronts would address the underlying causes of Sudan's chronic instability. Our immediate aim is a resolution of the conflicts in Sudan's Darfur region and in southern Kordofan and Blue Nile states. These conflicts are the greatest drivers of human rights abuses and of war-induced deprivation. They threaten the peace between Sudan and South Sudan. We believe that an agreement on a cessation of hostilities and humanitarian access is an attainable near-term goal. The African Union shares this vision. We were encouraged in April when Sudan and the SPLM North entered into one-day talks facilitated by the African Union. We felt that it was a positive sign that the parties could engage each other directly and perhaps come to agreement on a cessation of hostilities and humanitarian access. Further talks since have been postponed repeatedly by the Sudanese government. It is uncertain whether or when they will start again. Meanwhile, recent military operations by both sides have greatly diminished the political space for talks, though the start of the rainy season impedes the movement of ground forces and may now provide a new opening for talks. We are working closely with the African Union to get both parties back to the table. Our second aim is a political settlement that involves all relevant Sudanese groups, including political parties, civil society, the private sector, and traditional and religious leaders. We believe that a participatory, inclusive, and transparent constitution-making process could produce governing arrangements that could end Sudan's chronic instability, address severe imbalances in political power and government resources between Sudan's central region and the rest of the country, and establish the basis for a peaceful, democratic, and prosperous country. Governance that systematically excludes certain Sudanese regions and communities produces Sudan's interminable conflicts. From my discussions with Sudanese and friends of Sudan, I know that there is a widening recognition among all parties that it is time to apply a unified, holistic approach to resolving Sudan's conflicts. Partial regional solutions cannot permanently overcome Sudan's chronic instability and historical patterns of conflict. Before I close, sir, I'd like to update you on the status of agreements between Sudan and South Sudan. In early June, the government of Sudan announced that it would stop South Sudan's oil exports in 60 days if Juba did not end its support for insurgents in Sudan. This threatened action strains the framework of the cooperation agreement Sudan and South Sudan signed last September 27. Former South African President Mbeki, the chair of the AU mediation panel, responded with letters to the leaders of both countries outlining a plan to use existing mechanisms to complete demilitarization of the border and verify the cessation of support for rebels on either side of the border. Both Sudan and South Sudan have accepted President Mbeki's plan. We have reason to be hopeful that this most recent crisis in relations between the two states may be overcome, but this brinksmanship must end. We call on both parties to implement all the September 27 cooperation agreements expeditiously and without preconditions. We support the efforts of the African Union and the United Nations to resolve the status of the disputed Abyei region between Sudan and South Sudan. Final determination of Abyei status is a major piece of unfinished business from South Sudan's independence from Sudan. We support settlement of the dispute on the basis proposed by President Mbeki. Abyei has been the scene of horrendous human rights abuses. The Mbeki proposal contains wise provisions that respect the basic interests of Abyei's permanent residents and of the itinerant pastoralist community who have a long history of migrating back and forth through the region. In our contacts with Sudan's armed opposition groups, we encourage them to articulate a platform for peaceful political reform. At the same time, we are trying to find new avenues to make the same case to Sudan's leaders. To achieve a fundamental improvement in our relationship with Sudan, there must be sustained improvement in the situation in Darfur, progress in implementing the September 27th agreements with South Sudan, and an end to the conflict in southern Kordofan and Blue Nile states. In short, Sudan must stop bombing its own citizens and depriving them of humanitarian relief. The pathway to peace is open dialogue, democracy, and respect for human rights. We are looking at ways to deliver that message directly to senior decision makers in Khartoum. Finally, while I realize that today's focus is on human rights in Sudan, I would be remiss, especially given the mandate of this body, if I did not also raise our concerns about the situation in South Sudan. The U.S. partnership with South Sudan is strong. We contributed significantly toward the achievement of self-determination by the South Sudanese people. We greeted the birth of the world's newest democracy with great joy. But that democracy is exceedingly fragile. Lately, we have been concerned that disputes among its leaders have increased ethnic tensions and could spark violent conflict within South Sudan. South Sudan's leaders must find ways of working out their differences peacefully, openly, transparently, in well-understood democratic fashion, both within their party and in the nation more generally. In Jonglei State, there have been credible reports of widespread human rights abuses by both rebels and the South Sudan military. We are encouraging South Sudan's government to end human rights violations, provide accountability for past abuses, and ensure that the UN mission in South Sudan has full, unfettered access to all areas of its operations and is able to fulfill its mandate to protect civilians. With assistance from the UN mission for South Sudan, the government can build local support for reconciliation and development, These issues, we fear, are part of a larger pattern of abuse that are described at some length in the State Department's latest human rights report. South Sudan faces many challenges today, including a still difficult relationship with its neighbor to the north, but its long struggle for self-determination has become an ongoing struggle to create a democracy. We remain committed to helping the people of South Sudan and Sudan alike achieve the goals of two prosperous democratic states at peace with themselves and with one another. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to responding to your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony, and we'll now go to Ms. Limborg. And before you go, I should tell you, there's an overflow room, am I right? So if people don't want to, there's incredible interest in this, and so we have an overflow room to deal with. So if people don't want to stand, they can go to the overflow room. Anyway, if you want to stand, that's fine too. Ms. Limborg, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman McGovern, and we appreciate the opportunity to talk about this continuing serious human rights abuse and escalating humanitarian situation that is facing the people of Sudan. Thank you for your continued focus and passion for this issue. Just over a year ago, I testified to both the House and the Senate about worrisome sets of trends emerging across Sudan and South Sudan. And at that time, it was less than 1 year after that independence of South Sudan had brought nearly euphoric hope for a better way forward. Very sadly, the news remains grim. Millions of people in both countries continue to suffer from ongoing violence and extreme poverty. We are seeing some of the worst humanitarian conditions in years in Darfur, in the two areas of southern Kordofan and Blue Nile, and I would add Jonglei State in South Sudan. Malnutrition rates are soaring in parts of both states. Conflict is escalating and affecting communities on both sides of the north-south border. As my colleague Larry Andre has noted, the U.S. government continues to prioritize resolution of this crisis as a principal foreign policy goal with focused diplomatic initiatives. It remains a priority for our humanitarian assistance as well. We're committed to doing all that we can to meet the needs and at the same time promote a lasting peace. At the end of the day, however, the crisis can only be solved by the political will and commitment of the governments. I'd like to touch on a few drivers of the current escalation of crisis. First is we cannot overestimate the impact of the loss of the majority of oil reserves income following the separation of the two states. And as you know, after oil production ceased in January 2012 due to unresolved disputes between the two countries, it's had a huge impact on the economies and the human welfare of both. We've seen agreements to resume the flow of oil repeatedly derailed at enormous cost to the people of both Sudan and South Sudan. There are continued accusations of each supporting rebel movements on the other's territory, and they remain locked in a battle of recrimination and suspicion. In both countries, we've seen a failure to take the steps necessary to move out of crisis. Those who lose are the people of Sudan and South Sudan who have lived in poverty and conflict off and on for some 50 years. Today in Sudan, there are nearly 5 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. This is an astounding figure that equals about 15% of their population. A recent household survey indicates that 32% of children under 5 in Sudan are underweight, and there's 35% stunting. There are needs throughout the country, and conflict is spilling across the borders. I have written testimony that focuses in more detail, but let me focus today on Darfur and the two areas where you have that lethal combination of the bombardment of citizens, egregious human rights abuses, and lack of humanitarian access that are combining to create urgent and severe humanitarian needs. In Darfur, since January of this year, an upsurge in fighting between the Sudanese armed forces, armed opposition groups, as well as intercommunal clashes have resulted in large-scale new population displacements. And the continued attacks and brutal human rights abuses by Khartoum are abhorrent and unacceptable. We're seeing the continued and renewed sponsorship of proxy violence by the central government, as well as an increased loss of control after decades of arming militias that have now proliferated. A spreading lawlessness is resulting in heightened violence among heavily armed Arab groups, Fighting between these groups, the Darfur rebel groups, and the Sudanese armed forces has triggered massive new displacement. And according to the UN, just this year, more than 300,000 people have been displaced, and this is an imprecise figure. It's a dramatic uptick in displacement, and it is more than displacement for the last 2 years combined. The population of some of the IDP camps has swelled, reportedly by as much as 50%. As a result, on May 31st, the U.S. government issued a disaster declaration, a new one for Darfur, underscoring the increased and urgent emergency needs. Our Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance has activated our Rapid Response Fund. We're providing emergency shelter and food for the newly displaced persons, in addition to the ongoing caseload that we've been working with for the last decade. Unfortunately, as the needs spiral, the government of Sudan continues to impede access for humanitarian assistance, limiting our ability to reach people living in often appalling conditions. Access has always been difficult, but it's compounded by the new directive issued by the government of Sudan on March 31st of this year that has new rules on the issuance of travel permits, and it further restricts the ability of international humanitarian staff to access many conflict areas. Through our international NGO and UN partners, we continue to provide humanitarian assistance in all the areas that we can access, and we continue to serve displaced populations, those in IDP camps as well as in local communities, and formerly displaced returnees to Darfur. Last year, we assisted 1.6 million people in every state of Darfur with more than $193 million in humanitarian assistance. This year to date, we've provided more than $65 million in life-saving humanitarian support and emergency food assistance. But sadly, we are unable to meet many of those who are newly displaced, and a fully effective humanitarian response must have unfettered humanitarian access to all affected areas. The U.S. government calls on all parties to the ongoing conflict to allow unrestricted assistance, unrestricted access for humanitarian aid. Turning to the two areas, 2 years after the conflict began there, the civilian population continues to bear the brunt of continued fighting and blocked access. In the SPLM North-held areas, indiscriminate aerial bombardment and shelling by the government of Sudan regularly kills civilians and prevents survivors from planting any crops or harvesting whatever meager yields they might have, thus not only subjecting them to violence from the skies, but depriving them of sustenance and livelihoods. In both southern Kordofan and Blue Nile, the needs are vast and increasing. The simple lack of food is increasing the vulnerability of local populations, often forcing them into refugee camps. And the U.S. government calls on both sides to refrain from indiscriminate shelling in civilian areas. International humanitarian agencies lack access to the SPLM North-controlled areas due to restrictions on cross-line access by the government of Sudan. And we have a continued failure of warring parties to agree to access for humanitarian assistance. Under these circumstances, the USAID-funded Famine Early Warning Systems Network, FuseNet, expects food security conditions to deteriorate in the SPLM North-controlled areas of the two areas to emergency levels. This means that 1 in 5 households during the June to September lean season will experience large gaps in food consumption. This means high malnutrition rates, it means excess mortality, it means children will die. UN agencies have been granted some access in the government-controlled areas, but access to the SPLM North-controlled areas remains officially closed for international aid agencies. This harsh policy violates the rights of more than 1 million people to receive urgently needed humanitarian assistance. Limited assistance provided through indirect support continues to delay the most extreme impact of these tactics, but it is no replacement for the full, unfettered humanitarian access that is urgently required. Both Khartoum and the SPLM North have recently voiced support for a 1-week ceasefire between the Sudanese armed forces and SPLM North that was proposed by UNICEF and the UN to allow the World Health Organization to implement a polio vaccination that would target more than 160,000 vulnerable children in the SPLM-controlled areas of the parts of the two areas. We must continue to press the SPLM North to seize this opportunity to test Khartoum's commitment. With the rainy season approaching, it's more vital than ever that both sides approve the vaccinations for children as well as the aid that's required. I can't overstate the devastating impact of these areas as well as the combination of bombardment and lack of access that has spread to other parts of Sudan and across the border into South Sudan. We continue to provide significant humanitarian assistance. We are the largest donor in Sudan, and we remain firmly committed to helping the people of both Sudan and South Sudan in these turbulent times. The violence will not be resolved overnight. The diplomatic initiatives continued, and in the meantime, it is imperative that we have unfettered access for the humanitarian community to provide assistance that is absolutely vital to preventing human and very innocent lives from being lost. We call on all parties, the government of Sudan, South Sudan, the mixed of armed groups across both countries, to uphold the commitments that they have made to hard-won peace agreements and to respect the most basic human rights. The people of Sudan, the people throughout both countries, have suffered far too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you both for your testimony. I have a few questions, and I will yield to my co-chair, Congressman Wolf. Mr. Andre, does the United States have a strategy to break the impasse on ending the multiple conflicts? I mean, are we committed to a comprehensive peace plan? Is the U.S. government committed to addressing the foundational problems of marginalization that are at the heart of Sudan's many years of wars and conflicts?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think you heard in the briefing reference to exactly those points. The need for a comprehensive solution, the need for what I was talking about, a two-point process. The first, immediate cessation of hostilities to get in the humanitarian relief, followed by a political process that would be inclusive, and would seek to resolve the historical pattern that has been intensified under this NCP government, but in fact has been there throughout Sudan history, of the center-periphery conflict, that is power and wealth concentrated in the center. As I mentioned earlier, earlier this month, I was in Nairobi meeting with Sudanese civil society who were there precisely to work out what a constitutional solution would be. These are Sudanese patriots trying to fight back against really pretty extreme repression, to think what is required. We back them. We support Sudanese civil society. We have been working with both the UN and especially of late with the African Union panel that is turning more and more to internal Sudanese issues. So I would say that would those are elements of our strategy.
No, and I think we appreciate the fact that we share the same goals here. It's you know, it's kind of like, you know, but the problem is, like we all say, we want to end the violence, and the violence is wrong. But how you get to that point, the details and the steps are not always clear. And you know, and this is you know, I mean, this has just been god awful, horrific for so many years now, and it just seems. And again, this is not just a U.S. responsibility. I think the international community has a responsibility to, to be part of the solution here too. But it doesn't seem we're making the kind of progress that I think a lot of us would hope.
American leadership, working with international institutions and other states, ended the horrendous fight between southern Sudan, now South Sudan, and the rest of Sudan. That was 4 decades, and there was those that said that could not be done. It was a long process. It had fits and starts. It wasn't easy, and as we all know, it remains serious tensions and even a possibility of a return to war on the border. We're doing all we can to prevent. The same thing with the internal crises in Sudan. It's hard, slow work. We have seen progress, and we see the fact that more and more parties are now talking about not what they call piecemeal peace, but a comprehensive solution. That is progress. We're even getting that from some Khartoum government influential people.
I have a few more questions for you and a couple for Ms. Limburg, but let me ask you again, Mr. Henry. And, in 2004, the United States government characterized the crimes in Darfur as genocide. What effort are we, as the U.S. government, taking to ensure that perpetrators of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide are brought to justice?
We just recently communicated to quite a number of our embassies where we think that some of those indicted by the International Criminal Court may travel, language for them to use with the governments, their host governments, to make certain that it is well understood our opposition to that travel. We continue to have a policy of not meeting or conducting business with those individuals who have been indicted. We look at what is happening in Sudan and know that their own personal calculations about their own futures is dictating their government's policies.
So Nafi Ali Nafi's invitation to meet with the administration will bring a well-known torturer and human rights abuser to Washington, D.C. As a former head of Sudan's National Intelligence and Security Service in the 1990s, Nafi masterminded a savage campaign of torture and killing in compounds known as ghost houses. Nafi has been in charge of the Sudanese government's Darfur portfolio. At times during the conflict in the western region, he's still a high-ranking advisor to Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir. What expectations should there be for this trip? I mean, is this a signal that the administration will be engaging in a new angle of diplomacy? Is this visit a sign of a renewed diplomatic push for a peaceful Sudan? And does the administration's invitation mean that the U.S. government will be willing to engage in direct negotiations with the administration of President Omar al-Bashir, who has been, as I said before, indicted by the International Criminal Court for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes? And, I just appreciate your kind of response to that, because it's gotten some attention, and we've got a number of expressions of concern from people.
Right. As I met with the Sudanese civil society and with the leadership of the armed movements opposed to the government in Khartoum, you can imagine the subject arose in those discussions as well. You heard me in my briefing mention that we are looking for any avenue to get our message to the senior decision maker level in Khartoum. When the decision was made in March to invite a delegation led by Nafi Ali Nafi, it wasn't made with any illusions as to his background. It was with the idea of trying to do all we can to end these conflicts. We regularly talk to the leaders of the armed movements, including here in Washington. I just met with them in East Africa. We needed a way to get our policies expressed to the senior leadership. We don't talk to the president. There are no senior leaders of this government that have nice pasts. Now, when that decision was made, a caveat was, and was expressed to Khartoum at the time, is that this visit could only take place in the context of a Sudan that is implementing its cooperation agreements with South Sudan. As of earlier this month, Sudan ceased implementing its agreements. We have passed the message back to Nafi Ali Nafi that as long as the government of Khartoum is suspending its implementation of those agreements, we are suspending any invitation.
That was my next question, was going to be, in light of the many agreements and understandings broken by the Khartoum regime, what mechanisms are in place to ensure that the administration's renewed engagement will work? And so as of right now, that visit is suspended?
As of right now, I mean, that's very fresh news. We've had deliberations about it, and recall that our focus, like yours, is to end these conflicts, get the humanitarian assistance in, and pull every lever we can and be as effective as we can. That means that we need to talk to some people with extremely problematic pasts.
Oh, and I appreciate that. For what it's worth, I'm glad that the visit is suspended, but there are other ways to communicate with bad guys too. But since it's suspended, let me end the question. Let me end the questioning of that right here on that. Let me just ask you one other question. I'm going to ask Ms. Limborg a couple of questions. Despite the existing UN arms embargo, arms manufactured in or supplied from Belarus, China, and the Russian Federation, or evidence of their use, have been found in Darfur, as well as other conflict areas in Sudan, such as southern Kordofan. In addition, the Sudanese government continues to fail to fully comply with the guarantees and commitments required by exporting countries when licensing arms transfer, a fact that does not seem to have led to a limitation of supply to Sudan by exporting countries. So given these facts, what are we doing to stop the flow of arms into Sudan? What kind of pressure are we bringing on some of these countries that, quite frankly, I think enable this regime to continue to survive?
One of the suppliers is Iran, which we don't have so much diplomatic leverage with, as you can imagine. Other suppliers,
Russia and China.
Other suppliers we have, and we've had those discussions, those démarches. I can't tell you that we have seen deals canceled, but we had very high levels in the supplier governments. We have made this known, and that's where things stand.
Yeah. I mean, for what it's worth, I mean, I think the situation. I mean, if we're all agreeing that this country's the government of Sudan has been guilty of genocide and crimes against humanity, that there ought to be some sort of consequence. I'm not quite sure what it is, but there ought to be some sort of consequence for those countries that welcome him, to their countries for visits, and that supply him arms. Whether it's Russia or China. I mean, there ought to be some consequence. I'm not saying that. I mean, there ought to be, because this is continuing. This has been a problem, and if his arms dry up, I mean, then it's a lot easier, I think, to be able to move forward on some of the things that you've talked about. So and that's kind of been a frustration, because we know where the arms are coming from, and we may not have a lot of juice with Iran, but God, I mean, I'd like to think that that we might have some influence, and by influence I mean if some of these countries don't comply, that there ought to be some pushback, some meaningful pushback. I mean, we're all agreeing, we're using the word genocide, so this is not just a violent civil conflict. So I just, Ms. Limborg, I just got a couple of questions. What can Congress do to ensure that more aid flows into South Kordofan, Blue Nile, and Darfur? I mean, will additional funding help?
The funding is not the issue; it's the lack of access. We need to continue to look for all ways to enable access, especially given what happens when the rainy season comes, and it just further shuts down the ability to access those areas. There is this opportunity to test the commitment that's been put on the table by Khartoum to allow the vaccination campaign to go forward. And we'd like to press forward on that opening as vigorously as possible, and that requires both sides to agree to that.
So how can the U.S. support civil society and opposition groups to build their ability to support democratic initiatives within Sudan? Because it's a challenge.
It is a challenge, and we do continue to support civil society groups, women's groups, all the ways that we can to strengthen the ability of the people of Sudan to have a voice and to indicate their desire for a more inclusive democracy. As you might imagine, the space to do that is relatively limited. We continue to do as much as we can without endangering any of the people that we support or partner with.
Let me just finally say, before I yield to Frank, I think what we're trying to figure out here is, what can we do more in Congress to kind of put the wind at the backs of those who are, fighting on behalf of human rights, and to try to put more pressure on the government of Sudan to stop this killing. And and I think I sometimes kind of feel powerless that we're sitting here watching this all unfold, and despite our good intentions, things continue to deteriorate, and it's just it's heartbreaking when you read the news accounts and we get the reports from what's happening on the ground. It is just awful, and I know you know that as well. So I would just say that if you guys have any brilliant ideas of things that we can do up here, to they're going to move this process along, or to provide more aid to those who need it, or put more pressure on some of the countries that are not helping in this process, please let us know. I'll yield to my colleague Frank Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with what Mr. McGovern said. I want to make it clear, and I think the administration has been a complete and total failure. Absolute failure. If my memory serves me, I was on the Mall when the large rally took place years ago. I think President Obama, as a senator, went there. On this issue of Sudan, the president's a failure. And I was hopeful that with Kerry coming, it'll be changing, and it's not changing. I mean, the very thought that you're going to bring NAFI here is just incredible. It shows you the standards of this town has sunk so low that it's almost, it's so low there are no standards. You've been to Darfur, haven't you? You've been to Darfur?
Yes, sir.
I was the first member of the House to go to Darfur. The genocide that was taking place then, and President Bush called it genocide, Secretary Powell called it genocide, and to his credit, he was very helpful in dealing with this issue. The Congress called it genocide, and you're inviting a genocidal person to Washington. I mean, he's gonna drive right by the Lincoln Memorial and the Jefferson Memorial, and it is immoral. It is absolutely immoral. It blows your mind. Anybody outside of Washington wouldn't even understand. I'm looking at the Atlantic. It said in October 2008, an LA Times journalist asked Nafi Ali Nafi, then an advisor to Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, whether he felt any regret over personally torturing opposition activists in the early 90s when Nafi was head of the country's internal intelligence service and Sudan was a hardcore Islamist state that sheltered Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden lived there from 92 to 96. In his characteristic style, reporter Edmund Sanders wrote, Nafi, quote, expressed no regret, saying opposition activists at the time were planning counter coups and civil war. It should come as no shock that a man like Nafi would have such a flippant attitude toward torture. He has dedicated his entire career to propagating such cruelties. According to that same article, Nafi was in charge of the government's Darfur portfolio. So what you saw and I saw, he was in charge of the portfolio. Now, some say 200,000 died, some say 500,000. I would probably go with a high figure, but maybe I'm wrong. But he was in charge of it. And at some points in the decade-long conflict, he's still a high-ranking advisor, and then it goes on. And then it says the man the Obama administration will be speaking with has blood on his hands, quite literally, as one of the most brutal members of the National Islamic Front regime and head of the National Intelligence Security Service. I think to bring this guy to town is immoral. I mean, I'm going to put something in the record. Anybody who meets with him, they're going to have to use a heavy sanitizer on their hands. Their conscience will never be clean. It is wrong. And the message that you're sending is that you're willing to deal with these people. I mean, you can make other analysis. So I think this is wrong. I'm glad it's canceled. Hopefully that'll give you an excuse that will never take place. But it ought not. It ought not take place. And don't forget, it has been called genocide. We have a museum on the Mall. never again. And so here a guy, he may even drive by the Holocaust Museum. If he comes up that way coming in, he may come up to the Capitol or the State Department. He may literally drive within a block of the Holocaust Museum. He'll the Washington Monument here, Jefferson Monument here, Lincoln Memorial here, and the Holocaust. He'll literally kind of weave right through it. That is crazy. The credibility of Secretary Kerry and President Obama will be destroyed in the eyes of the world. And every young person who had the Obama Hope bumper sticker on in the college campuses, man, they will say, we made a mistake. So do not invite the guy. And if you have him in town, I'm going to go after you guys every day. Every day. I may pick it down there with them. You cannot bring a guy like this to Washington. You cannot. And so I'm going to ask you if you would weekly update my office on where the status. Can we get that agreement? Update the office, my office, because I don't talk to you guys. You don't call me back and everything. Would you tell us what the status of the invitations are?
We'll keep
and when
you
you expect it to come, and if he's not coming?
Yes, sir. We'll keep you informed as this progresses. I want to make the point, if you permit me, that we will do whatever we can to end these conflicts, and
if
that
I may
means
take, and I appreciate that, but you haven't. And and you're going to have a chance. Let me ask you this: since Princeton Lyman left, how long ago has the Princeton Lyman left?
mid-March.
Mid-March, so 3 months plus. How many people have left the office since Princeton left?
How many people have left our office? No, we're whole. No one else has left.
No one has left the office?
Not since Princeton left in March.
Yeah.
Well, Ambassador Smith had left earlier, prior to Princeton's departure.
So the office is, you're kind of on the road. So the office is exactly the same. No one's left. Because I'm going to check it out right after this hearing. So you're at exactly the same.
I invite you to, sir. And I
know
can.
you do. You're exactly the same, right?
We have some new personnel. We have some personnel who have rotated to their next assignment. The number is the same. The number of people, effective people in this.
But a number of people have left who were with Princeton.
Who left with Princeton? No.
People who were working in the office at the time of Princeton Lyman, how many of those people who were part of his team have left?
None. We're all still here.
No left. Okay. Well, we'll check it out and see. That's not what I heard. Thirdly, on the question of what the chairman raised with regard to, and what you said you're going to do everything possible. We had asked the administration to support an amendment that we had that would have cut off aid to any country that allows Bashir to visit. Now, Bashir has been to China. They gave him the red carpet treatment. Bashir has been to other countries. The administration opposed our amendment. Now, if you're going to do everything possible to stop Bashir, everything possible to stop this activity, why would you not support something that says that if Bashir goes to a country, we will cut off non-humanitarian aid?
Yeah, sir, I don't have a response on the administration's stance towards that legislation.
Okay, well, last comment I'm going to make, Mr. Chairman, is the reason you're all going to fail on this is because you haven't done what President Bush did. President Bush appointed John Danforth. He was a United States Senator. He had a credibility up here on the Hill. He had credibility with the White House. He had credibility with the Secretary of State. He was appointed in a ceremony in the Rose Garden, I think the day before 9/11. On one side of Danforth stood Secretary Powell. On the other side stood George Bush, President Bush. We've asked that you put somebody like former Senator Feingold, somebody like that in, somebody who, the very fact that you don't have anybody over there, and the very fact that you've had this vacant for so long, and the very fact that you don't have anybody who has such credibility both in Africa and in the Congress and in the administration, I think, frankly, you're just going to fail. I think your policy is a failure. And as a result of the failure of your policy, I think people are dying every single day. I was in a camp in Yaita. The policy that you all had there, just disastrous. You were making the people move when they didn't want to move. I think it's been a disaster. And I think, whether you convince me or not, history will judge. And all the people who had hope that there was going to be a change, frankly, there will be no change. As long as the current policy stays, and you're going to invite guys like this to come to the nation's capital, and you don't put somebody like a John Danforth or a Feingold or somebody like that in. Now, I think you're just going to fail. Now, you want to say something, I should give you the time.
I've been racking my brain about who's left the office, and I can tell you that the one person that has occurred to me is my deputy, who is rotating to his next assignment, and his replacement is coming next month. But we'll share with you exactly what the personnel status is from the day that Princeton left and to today is. On the question of the visit, as I said from the beginning, it was understood that this visit could only take place in the context of Sudan implementing the cooperation agreements. That is not happening now. That is why the visit is suspended. We will have a new special envoy. The president and
When?
It's not up to me. The secretary was asked that question in Addis Ababa during the African Union Summit. He said soon. So I would take that to mean soon, but I don't know when. When we do have a special envoy, we will want that special envoy to have access at senior levels in Khartoum. Again, to be effective, we need to talk to both sides. We talk to the leadership of the armed movements. We need to talk to senior levels in the government. And that means that when the special envoy goes to Khartoum, he gets that access. When they send a delegation led by someone who has actual decision-making power, then we have a possibility of achieving something in terms of ending these horrendous conflicts. That one thing that we learned from Princeton is to put foremost in our minds those people who are suffering and what can we do to end that suffering. That is what motivates us. And we don't always get to choose who the decision makers are on the other side, but to be effective, you have to talk to the decision makers. And I just wanted to bring up that point. We understand the passion. We understand the horrendous background of a number of key figures in this government. We have to do business in order to end the conflicts.
You can talk to them in Kenya. You can talk to them in Ethiopia. You can even talk to them in Khartoum. But you ought not be bringing somebody like that to the nation's capital.
You mentioned Ethiopia, sir. That reminds me of another point that I wanted to raise as regards the travel. As I mentioned, we have taken the action of informing all embassies, all of our embassies abroad in countries where we think there's a possibility that any of the indictees may travel, so that they are already on a moment's notice, because sometimes these trips happen with very little fanfare prior. To go in and use our influence to try to stop this. We have been successful in the past in getting some of these visits stopped.
What ones?
Yeah, I think you're familiar with the Malawi.
I think with all deference, I called you all and asked you to move, and your assistant secretary said, yeah, that makes sense. We did a number of things. We offered a member. I don't know that the administration could take. What other ones? What other trips were canceled?
A recent trip to Chad, but that is problematic because of the security agreement that ended the conflict between Chad and Sudan, that there is reciprocal visits of the defense ministers. The presidential visit was ended. But I wanted to get back to Ethiopia for a moment. There have been visits by President Bashir both to Addis Ababa to sign the cooperation agreements, the 9 cooperation agreements with South Sudan back in September. And there was a visit to Juba, South.
Cuba, that's appropriately fine. That's where the conflict is. Ethiopia's been the area where the talks.
And the visit to Ethiopia was not a bilateral visit to the government of Ethiopia. It was in the context of the African Union mediation to end the conflict between the two states.
But he's gone. I'll end with he's gone to another number of other countries. There was a picture I saw in one of the papers here where they rolled the red carpet out for him in China. If Milosevic had gone to another country during the former Yugoslavian war, because Milosevic was guilty of genocide, what he did in Srebrenica and what he did in Vukovar and what he did, had he gone to another country, America would have been up in arms. We would have spoken out. So if we cared so deeply because somebody was on the continent of Europe because of the genocide, we should feel equally strongly and speak out because it's taken place in Sudan. And the very fact that there's a dual policy, we have let one go because there are people of little power versus the other. It took place on the European continent. I think that's wrong. I think it's immoral. You ought to be speaking. He should travel nowhere, and anyone connected to genocide ought not be allowed. And quite frankly, I think Nafi's visit here may very well be in conflict with the law of the land. It may not even be permitted. There may be a statute that prohibits this. But anyway, with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back to you.
Oh, thank you. And I think the point has been made clearly that we are relieved and glad that the visit has been canceled. We understand you got to talk to the bad guys to work out a deal sometimes, but I think we're all in agreement that it would be inappropriate for him to come to the United States. I think that would be a signal that I think would not be helpful in terms of demonstrating our commitment to human rights. So I'd like to yield to my colleague from Maryland, Donna Edwards.
Thank you very much, and I apologize I wasn't here earlier for your testimony, but I do share the concerns that have been expressed both by Mr. Wolf and Mr. McGovern. My question is goes to the role of the Chinese government, and if you can tell us what levels of financial assistance are being provided to Sudan and what their interest is or the will in leveraging their assistance to try to get some resolution. Is that a pathway that we've been working?
Yes. When we first got the word about the decision in Khartoum to suspend its oil agreement and start a 60-day shutdown of the transshipment of South Sudanese oil to Port Sudan, I contacted, along with our Acting Assistant Secretary for the Africa Bureau, Don Yamamoto. The two of us spoke with the Special Envoy for China to Africa, who has special emphasis on the Sudans. We informed him that this was in fact in violation, that the agreements do not permit any such cessation of the oil transshipment unless there's technical reasons, and it's not to be, explicitly was not to be used to pressure on other aspects of the relationship. He followed up with meetings that he held with both governments. He was just in Darfur for the special envoy meetings in Darfur with the head of UNAMID, Mohammed Ibn Chambas, and we're getting a report out from our ambassador who represented us there, Chargé Joe Stafford, on the Chinese interventions trying to end to support UNAMID and what has been an escalation in the conflict in Darfur.
Thank you. And just to follow up on that, can you tell us more precisely the role that oil is playing in the tensions that are ongoing right now between the Sudan and South Sudan, and what is the United States doing to try to broker that tension?
On on the oil question, the tension is from the government of Khartoum's point of view, they lost 75% of their revenue, their oil revenue, when South Sudan became an independent nation. They negotiated this agreement along with 8 other agreements, with as part of the agreement that each one is independent of the other. And you can't use one to get satisfaction on another point. We had consultations with the African Union mediation. President Mbeki sent letters to both presidents, which they subsequently accepted, on how very specific steps to address the demilitarization of the border, which is incomplete, and to address the question of assistance to rebel movements in the other country. Since then, we're seeing positive movement in the oil transshipment issue. We haven't yet seen Khartoum back away from their threat to shut it down in 60 days. But we're seeing acceptance of the Mbeki letter and an acceptance of a process that would resolve the questions that led them to take that act.
And if you would, and I apologize again if you've already answered these questions, and just say, hey, I've already answered those questions.
Try and keep it short.
But I wonder if you could just describe the administration's assessment of the security situation in South Kordofan, Blue Nile, Darfur, and Abyei.
The current situation in, okay, for Abyei, we strongly back the Mbeki proposal for resolving the issue of Abyei, which is the big unfinished business for South Sudanese independence. It's the most strongly felt, a very emotive subject in both countries. We think that the Mbeki plan is very wise in how it has removed this as a zero-sum game. It preserves the basic interests of both the permanently resident community and the transient community, and sees that the referendum is those who permanently live there, but with rights for the traditional access to pastures and so forth for the nomadic community from Sudan. The current situation, I might ask my colleague to talk about U.S. government's preparedness to assist with the referendum. The referendum is to take place in October. That's how it's currently scheduled.
But if you had to look at each of these areas, if you looked at South Kordofan, if you looked at Blue Nile, Darfur, what is the individual assessment of the security situation?
The conflict in Darfur has escalated, so that the first 6 months of this year has seen more displacement than in the previous 2 years combined. Most of that violence has been not between the armed groups and the government, rather it's between militias supported by Khartoum fighting one another, and showing some signs that they are slipping out of control of their
Has that resulted in a displacement of about another 130,000 or so, 300,000 Darfuris?
Yeah, and that displacement has many causes, but the prominent is pro-government militias, pro-government communities fighting one another.
And again, all right. Let me, if I could just one other, if you don't mind. Thank you. I want to turn to Ms. Lindborg. It's always hard to say that because, hi, how are you? You too. I just want to ask you, on the second panel, Mr. Prendergast is involved with the Satellite Sentinel project that uncovers threats to civilians using satellite imagery in order to generate a rapid response. What's going on with what's going on in several countries around the world? Does the State Department view this as a model that can be used for monitoring other conflicts?
You know, it's certainly an important source of data, and we look at a variety of data points to try to ascertain as best we can, particularly in areas with constrained access, what's happening. And I would just add also to your previous question that in Darfur and in the two areas, the security situation is that there is continued aerial bombardment for citizens, and there's a lack of access for humanitarian workers. So it's important to get all possible means of information so that we can better understand what the situation might be. In Abyei, the humanitarian situation is actually rather stable, and we are able to get in there with greater regularity and provide assistance both for communities who have returned, those who remain south of the River Kir, and also standing ready to provide technical assistance should the Abyei Area Referendum Commission get up and running, hopefully by October.
I just feel like we, continue to kind of wait for the atrocities to happen to respond instead of trying to figure out how it is that we can stop them and get a resolution. And I think it's very frustrating for many of us as members, obviously frustrating for the broader community. And I don't understand what it is that the United States is doing to leverage our, allies, other partners, to resolve the various conflicts.
I'm going to pass it over to my colleague who's talked about some of these already. I would just underscore, as Larry mentioned earlier, that the efforts of Ambassador Lyman and continued by Larry Andre have been to put the humanitarian issues at the top of all the negotiations. And I think everybody shares the frustration and the concern and the anxiety about the level of continuing human rights abuses and needs. It is unacceptable, and the solution set is not easy. But
in my consultations with the African Union mediation panel just a week and a half ago, that continued to be their focus, and a focus that frankly we lobbied for. The negotiations do give primacy to cessation of hostilities, followed by humanitarian access. That's the number one, then followed up by talks that will obviously take much longer to resolve the underlying causes of the conflicts. But we're not going to wait for that discussion to be completed before we get the urgently needed assistance to those who are suffering.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just hope we are not just sort of continuing to provide an enabling role for
All right. Thank you very, very much for coming. We appreciate your testimony, your answering our questions. We will obviously be in touch. And again, as I said at the end of my questioning, if you guys have any ideas of things that we need to be doing here, to help move this process forward, to help end the humanitarian crisis, please let us know. Thank you very much. Our next panel will consist of John Prendergast, the co-founder of the Enough Project and co-founder Satellite Sentinel Project, Ken Isaacs, Vice President, Programs and Government Relations, Samaritan's Purse, E.J. Hagendorn, Deputy Director, Africa International Crisis Group, Jahan Henry, a Senior Researcher on Sudan, Africa Division, Human Rights Watch. And when everybody's seated, we will begin with Mr. Prendergast. Here, yeah. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Congressman McGovern, Congressman Wolf, Congresswoman Edwards. Appreciate your continuing leadership on this issue. I just returned from the Darfuri refugee camps in eastern Chad, and earlier this year went to the Nuba Mountains. Some of my colleagues are going to describe what is going on directly to your last question, Congressman Edwards, in those areas. So I want to just shoot right to the issues that I think you've been driving at, which is what options does the United States have, policy-wise, to rather than tread water, which we've been doing for so long, move it forward to real solutions in Sudan. So U.S. policy, I think very fundamentally we agree that U.S. policy has been stuck in neutral for quite some time. It's been hamstrung by all kinds of competing priorities: counterterrorism cooperation, humanitarian access, Sudan, South Sudan peace, human rights considerations. I think we heard this very clearly today, reading between the lines in Mr. Andre's testimony. I counted a bunch of them, but just quickly, this idea that we're about to have, or we're on the brink of, or we believe there is going to be a humanitarian access agreement. I mean, it's based on nothing. Support for this Darfur peace process that stovepipes Darfur and hives it off from the rest of the country. We just sent the charge, he just mentioned it, we sent the charge to this meeting of envoys and endorsed a continuation of this dead process. It's unbelievable. The administration's saying we want a comprehensive agreement, and then they're supporting precisely what Khartoum wants, which is divide and conquer through separate peace processes. And then I saw him saying how the Sudan opposition and civil society hadn't made any progress in developing a vision for the future. Well, they worked at very strong U.S. government under very strong U.S. government pressure to develop just such a thing called the New Dawn Charter, which they signed in the beginning of this year, and we've done very little to nothing to then advance that dialogue and discussion. And then the last thing, a complete misunderstanding of what's going on in Darfur today. As if just tribes are fighting, militias are fighting, like there's no role that the Sudan government has in that. The complete opposite of the truth. It's a complete misunderstanding of basic conflict dynamics. How are you going to help solve a problem if you don't understand the problem? So it was disturbing, frankly, to listen to that testimony. And we could go on about the NAFIA stuff, but look, they suspended it, so I guess you can throw things at a dartboard eventually and hit it. So giving credit to President Obama's personal diplomacy in 2011 with heavy congressional pressure in support of the referendum. That was definitely building on the success of the Bush administration's comprehensive peace agreement for the very reasons that Congressman Wolf outlined. But since then, I think this policy, our policy in Sudan, has just drifted. We issue these statements, we offer incentives for better behavior, we invite people to come that have no business coming here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but not addressing the fundamental issue. What's the fundamental issue? Everyone knows by now. It's the governance in Sudan. If you don't transform that center in Sudan, we're going to see instability for as long as we're all working on these issues. So I think I want to just dive right in, given the time constraints, into the areas that I think with Congress in the lead, the executive branch, the United States can make a difference. All of it requires a different approach to what we are doing today. And I've listed them in bullets here. The first one is this idea, which I should just reference, promoting a comprehensive peace. Instead of this divide and rule, separate peace processes, we need to work relentlessly and tirelessly for the development of one Sudan peace process, which brings everything together with a very prominent mediator, backed by a very strong U.S. envoy, as you said, working with other envoys and putting pressure, just as Colin Powell did, just as Special Envoy Danforth did in the 2000s, in support of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. We need to revitalize that approach. We already have a successful model. Let's use it and apply it to today's Sudan. And that means we have to recognize and increasingly value the Sudan Revolutionary Forces, the SRF, the primary armed opposition, and work with them to improve their human rights record, to support them to become more inclusive, and better prepare them to become the prime interlocutor of a peace process that needs to take shape in Sudan. The second area that I think the U.S. can be supportive is providing assistance for media. The opposition and civil society in Sudan are at a severe disadvantage because of state monopoly on the press. And they can't communicate their platforms, they can't communicate their agendas. Nobody even knows the truth about what's going on in half of the country. So the United States has a record of being supportive of independent media in other countries. And we've seen that bear fruit over the last few years, history of this kind of assistance. So we need to do the same, I think, in Sudan. Independent TV, independent radio, how can we help and support that? The third area is assisting democratic governance. What I found to be one of the most catalytic elements of U.S. policy during the North-South War, and Congressman Wolf saw this when he was in southern Sudan when it was still part of Sudan, and that is that the U.S. assisted the dominant rebel group, the SPLA, in developing civil administration capacities, developing their ability to govern in the areas that they controlled in opposition areas in Sudan, in southern Sudan, what became eventually South Sudan. This prepared these guys for future government. This helped them be more able to facilitate humanitarian assistance to the areas that they control, which Khartoum is blocking as part of its food as a weapon strategy. So building the capacity of the civil administration structures of these opposition groups in the areas that are controlled by the rebels, just as we did during the North-South War, would be a tremendously catalytic thing over time in supporting future democratic governance. Fourth thing the United States could do is to enhance coalition building. The U.S., I think, could help the Sudanese efforts, the opposition and civil society, the rebels, these three sort of legs of potential transformation. They need to have greater opportunities to interact. There's a lot of suspicions, and we all know what results when opposition is divided. It allows the government in power to remain in power as long as those divisions are so deep that they undermine cohesion to support real democratic transformation and real change. So helping to support the interactions and between these groups and developing their joint platforms would be really helpful. And the fifth is building institutional capacities. The United States has provided some capacity building support for some civil society groups, and that's really important. Been doing it for a number of years, and they should keep doing it, but expand it to the SRF, the dominant rebel coalition that brings all these guys together, and help build their capacity, I think would be really important. Investing in some of these youth groups that are going to be so important and have been so important to change in the Middle East and North Africa. So those are 5 things. There are many others. The most important lesson that I've learned last 20 years, 25 I guess now, working on Sudan, is that the political constituency for peace in Sudan here in the United States matters. Members of Congress in the lead, student organizations, faith-based groups, human rights advocates, sometimes when the celebrities show up and get arrested with you guys, others comprising the anti-genocide movement have put Sudan's plight on the mattering map of the U.S. government over 3 presidencies. Great bipartisan effort, and this is a perfect example of it, has been expended in ending the North-South War, in providing life-saving humanitarian aid to millions of Darfuris and to people in South Kordofan and Blue Nile, and supporting the creation of the world's newest state in South Sudan. Another great populist push is needed, and Congress needs to be at the forefront. Its people still suffer, but they're coming together in support of a better future, and we should stand with them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your excellent testimony. Do you want to be special envoy? Thank you. Well, that's precisely what we need. That's why we need you. Mr. Isaacs. Is your microphone on? Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank you for holding this very important meeting and allowing me to testify today. I've worked in Sudan for 20 years with many people in this room, and it's just the thing that just keeps on giving. It doesn't go away. None of the tactics have changed of the government of Sudan, whether they call themselves the National Salvation Front, the National Islamic Front, or now the National Congress Party. But today I want to talk specifically about the humanitarian crisis that exists and is growing and deteriorating in South Kordofan and Blue Nile states. As I said, we've worked there a long time. When the conflict recently started in June of 2011, we had over 200 staff in Nuba Mountains, and we have maintained contact with those staff throughout these 2 years. We're working extensively in the camp in Yida, so we have a lot of in-source information coming to us. I go to Nuba Mountains routinely and was just there about 2 weeks ago. The condition there is bad. You gave an excellent briefing in the beginning. You understand what those circumstances are. We hope to have see some kind of data come out from the scrappy little entities that are up there with any kind of access that are trying to do anything. But it really is hard to get a picture of what's going on. But what I do know from my travel there most recently and you know, over the last 2 years is that people are terrorized and they are living like animals. They're living like animals in rocks and in caves, and they're eating leaves and bugs. And this isn't just a photo op where you go up and you find 1 or 2 or 3 people. You can go find tens of thousands of people living this kind of life. In southern Blue Nile, they don't have the advantage of having rocks. They have tall grass. They live in tall grass, and they're eating whatever that they can find, foraging for foods. This is a group of people that essentially live in a Stone Age. They don't have grinding mills. They grind, if they have anything to grind, they grind it between rocks. 2 years ago, 95% of the people that lived in Nuba Mountains had 3 meals a day. Now 95% of the people that live there have less than 1 meal a day. This is a clear, orchestrated campaign of famine driven by terror at indiscriminate bombing of civilian targets. So I thought, Congressman Montgomery, you brought up a good question. So what's different? What can be different about this? When I look at the entire paradigm of what is going on in Blue Nile and what's going on in South Kordofan, the starvation, the malnutrition, the lack of access to clean water, the fact that the schools are shut down, the health clinics are gone. We've got 200,000 refugees that have fled the area into South Sudan. You've got 600,000 people in Kordofan who are displaced. They're literally starving. I've got photographs I could show you, but you've seen photographs of starving people before. So I'm a humanitarian guy. I'm not a political guy. I'm not a military guy. I actually was the director of the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistant in 2004, 2005, and managed the Darfur portfolio. But I didn't like living in Washington. I didn't like working for the government because I'm too plain spoken. But if I look at what's going on today, and I have met with Bashir, I have met with Ahmed Haroun, I know Salva, I knew John Garang, I know all those guys top to bottom on both sides. There's one thing that I see that could make a catalytic change in the humanitarian situation and maybe give space to breathe in the developing political needs that my colleague here, JP, was speaking of. The destruction of 2 military airstrip air traffic control towers, one in Kadugli and one in El Abeid. That's where the attacks are coming from. It doesn't have to be a no-fly zone. It doesn't have to be extensive loss of life. It doesn't need to be an extended bombing campaign. But it needs to be a signal, a resolute signal to the government of Sudan. I've tracked these guys and worked with them for 20 years. They do not give a damn about the diplomatic words of the United States government or any other country. They care about force. And I would even argue that the comprehensive peace agreement materialized because they were afraid they would come into the sights of the United States. And they therefore became a friend in the war against terror. They were the fox in the hen house. They're still the fox in the hen house. As the bombing in April, somebody bombed their weapons factory. Nobody's owned up to it, but somebody took it out. These guys have blood all over their hands. They've had blood on their hands since they came to power in 1989. There is the SRF. There is a coalition of troops that are coming together. They do need inputs to build a sort of a political coalition. But I don't see a change unless something like that happens. I can see 10 years. This is the 3rd time I've testified before this committee on Sudan. And I'm always honored to be here. I wish that the next time I came I could tell you something that's different on the ground. we're not there yet. And so anyway, from the practical humanitarian guy that doesn't work for the government anymore, I'm free to speak my mind, and I've spoken, and I really appreciate the opportunity to say it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your candor, and I hope the next time we have a hearing, I mean we're doing this hearing and because we don't think anything has changed. Things are getting worse, so we need to reevaluate. But having said that, Mr. Hagendorn, welcome, and welcome your testimony.
Well, thank you very much for inviting Crisis Group to testify. War resumed. Yes, it is. War resumed 2 years ago in South Kordofan and Blue Nile and shows no sign of ending. There are echoes of the earlier civil war, but the dynamics are quite different, particularly in South Kordofan, where the SPLM North is much stronger, controls more territory, and is part of the Sudan Revolutionary Front alliance. This time, the government also has more troops and sophisticated equipment, and these forces are again augmented by poorly trained and ill-disciplined paramilitary units. Unable or unwilling to attack fortified rebel units in the mountains, the military has resorted to indiscriminate bombing and shellings. Government forces also have resorted to striking at communities suspected of supporting the rebels and prevent most humanitarian access to insurgent-controlled areas. That said, it should be noted that the Sudan Revolutionary Front artillery attacks have also killed non-combatants, and there are troubling indications South Sudanese refugee camps are becoming militarized. The war has settled into a vicious stalemate where the government is unable to dislodge the rebels in the mountains and the SPLM North incapable of holding much territory in the lowlands. Neither side is strong enough to win militarily. A negotiated settlement is the only viable solution. Most analysts agree the main cause of continued conflict is the concentration of power and resources in the center. However, repeated pledges to transform governance remain unfulfilled. Multiple peace agreements have not ended chronic conflict because they were piecemeal and have only been partially implemented. Often, later agreements would shift power, resources, and attention away from earlier treaties. So, for example, Darfur negotiations shifted attention from the peace agreement with the South, a significant reason its democratization provisions languished and unity was not attractive to most Southerners. The regime stayed in power for so long because it was sustained by oil from the South. Now it is in an existential crisis. The economy is in shambles, and members of the ruling party are deeply unhappy with their leaders, massive corruption, endless conflict, and the division of their country. At the same time, political opposition forces are growing more assertive, and the slowly expanding war is bleeding the military and draining the treasury. Calls for reform are growing, but Bashir is a wily survivor. Although he has stated he will not run for re-election, many doubt he will cede power for fear he will end up at the International Criminal Court. Instead, many hope for a coup or a popular uprising that could force him out. But there is a great risk. The president has deliberately fragmented the security services, and there are numerous armed tribes that could seek to take advantage of turmoil in the capital. A Libya-like scenario is a distinct possibility, and the regime plays up this prospect with its constituents. So far, it has successfully cast the Sudan Revolutionary Front as only representing the peripheries and inherently hostile to the people of the Nile Valley. The U.S. government should learn lessons of past failed initiatives. Sudan needs a truly comprehensive peace agreement, not a partial settlement that perpetuates the status quo. At the same time, it must recognize the NCP needs to be part of any transition. As we have learned in Iraq, leaving the long-ruling party out in the cold would be costly. Its elites are too powerful to ignore, and the opposition is too divided and inexperienced to rule alone. The rebels have a national agenda, but divisions remain. Those differences are benefiting the government's strategy to limit peace talks and subsequent agreements to local issues in order to prevent reform at the center. A separate deal on the two areas, or even the Blue Nile, would be easier for diplomats, but is unlikely to address the root causes of wars in Sudan. Sooner or later, Bashir and his inner circle will have to reach their own conclusion that the present crisis requires more radical adjustments. When they do, the international community should consider providing incentives. These should be tied to specific and irreversible benchmarks. Such cooperation might be unpalatable to many who hold Bashir responsible for atrocity crimes, but is necessary to prevent further conflict and continued humanitarian crises for the foreseeable future. Crafting the right strategy and incentives will require bold leadership and careful coordination. We urge the administration, therefore, to appoint a strong special envoy and provide him or her with all the necessary support to develop and implement an international strategy to promote peace in both countries. That should include working with partners for a single, comprehensive solution that runs in parallel with the negotiations between Sudan and South Sudan, but are not conditioned on them. Urging the government to bring the NCP, the Sudan Revolutionary Front, other opposition forces, and civil society groups together in a transitional government that leads first and foremost to a comprehensive ceasefire and humanitarian access, and allow the political forces to flesh out a roadmap for a durable peace process. Offering President Bashir, as well as party elites, incentives to create a transitional government and firmly and irreversibly place Sudan on a transitional path, including assistance to stabilize the economy on the condition that transitional roadmap benchmarks are met and progress is made in negotiations with South Sudan, and if concrete moves are made toward a credible transition process, the Security Council should request the International Criminal Court to defer prosecution of Bashir for 1 year. There would be no obligation to renew such deferrals if Bashir reneges on this transition commitment. Supporting also through training and capacity building the establishment and growth of national parties that can represent and articulate the demands of Sudan's marginalized people. Sudan deserves another chance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Henry.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for allowing me to come and testify today, and to the committee for continuing to focus on Sudan. Like other people here, Human Rights Watch has been working on Sudan for a long time, more than 20 years, documenting abuses during the civil war in Darfur, following the secession, and now in the last couple of years. And it is sad for us too to have to come back here to testify again. As people have said today already, the human rights situation is markedly deteriorated in the past 2 years with the new conflicts erupting in southern Kordofan and Blue Nile, and all of the displacement and deprivation that has brought, and the bombing, which are indiscriminate bombing, but also targeted ground attacks using militia, and the humanitarian situation for those people who are stuck, especially behind rebel lines, is particularly severe and appalling. But today I wanted to focus my remarks on Darfur. 10 years since fighting broke out, since the major conflict broke out there between rebels and government forces. Basically to emphasize something that I think people have remarked today, the rise in inter-ethnic conflict in Darfur. It's true, though, the dominant political conflict in Darfur is fighting between government and rebel forces. There are numerous other inter-ethnic conflicts with political dimensions that also feature in Darfur and have intensified this year. So of the some 300,000 newly displaced, the figure that's been cited today, we think close to 200,000 have fled just from inter-ethnic fighting alone. And these conflicts are said to reflect weak or absent law enforcement, no rule of law. Sudan has lost control of the area. And Sudanese authorities have also said, repeatedly, we cannot control these tribal fights. But this analysis overlooks the reality that the Sudanese government has a responsibility, no matter what the root causes are of inter-ethnic fighting, and there are many, to be sure, land, gold, many, and these conflicts are, they're called localized conflicts, tend to be incredibly complex when you really look at them. But the government has its responsibility to protect civilians and to prosecute those responsible for the offenses, which it is not doing. The government also has not been a bystander, and this is what I wanted to emphasize today. Massive attacks are being carried out against the civilian population by forces using government equipment and involving government security officials. One of those officials is the known militia leader, Ali Kosheb, who is already wanted on an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court for war crimes and crimes against humanity in West Darfur in 2003-04. So just to emphasize, interethnic fighting in Darfur should be understood as a consequence of Sudan's support for certain groups to fight alongside the government. And it is a consequence of the government's utter failure to rein them in or disarm them, embark on any form of DDR, or provide any kind of accountability, notwithstanding all of its claims that it is actually doing those things. And UNAMID, the peacekeeping missions, claims that it is also helping the government to do those things. No progress. Let me just dive into one particular episode. I was in Chad, on the Chadian border with Central Darfur last month. More than 30,000 people had recently arrived in the area following a massive attack on a part of Central Darfur on that border that's largely populated by the Salamat ethnicity. The Salamat are an Arab group. They also have a presence in Chad. They sort of straddle the border. They live amongst other Arab groups in the area. This is not a conflict that involves the classic African versus Arab. No, these are Arab groups who live in this area and have had various histories with the government. So based on this research, and I interviewed lots of people who had arrived in this refugee area, a picture emerged of very coordinated attacks that started on April 5th at a town called Biltebe and continued for several days, or maybe even weeks, as the attackers continued to loot and burn properties. They destroyed entire villages, dozens of villages, and killed at least 100 Salamat civilians, but probably others from other ethnicities as well, and injured at least as many. Almost everyone fled the area to Chad, where we talked to them, or to other parts of Darfur. The aid groups haven't been able to access the area. The area is incredibly remote. It sits on the corner, on the border of CAR, Darfur, and Chad. No one goes there. So the UN mission also said that it was unable to access the area. It's not just remoteness, it's because the Sudanese government didn't allow them. They asked several times, but the remoteness doesn't help matters here. The witnesses identified the attacking forces as Misriya, Taish, and Rezegat, other Arab groups. And they identified government cars, and they identified cars belonging to the Central Reserve Police and the Border Intelligence. These are both auxiliary forces that the government has created to essentially absorb the former Janjaweed militia. For years now, we've been hearing about the Central Reserve Police and the Border Intelligence, and the government saying, well, we don't have militias because they're all part of the actual forces. Well, these forces were created to absorb the militias. So we had eyewitnesses say that they had seen Ali Kushaib, this man who was wanted by the International Criminal Court, at the scene of the attack. The area that was attacked it's pictured up there, and I will flip through in a second. But just to let you know, that particular town is the largest in that area. It's called Abu Jaradil. And on April 8th, large numbers of heavily armed men, mostly wearing khaki, according to witnesses, arrived in 2 waves, first early in the morning, then a few hours later on foot and in vehicles. They shot in the market indiscriminately. They burned homes and shops, stole livestock, and looted. And if you know anything about what kind of violence occurred in Darfur during the height of the conflict, these are familiar sights, right? Completely looted goods. The Salamat villagers said that they had fought back, but that they were completely overrun by the attacking forces, who had very fancy weaponry that people say only the government could have supplied. It was very hard for us to independently verify what types of weapons were used exactly, but we were able to show the extent of the damage, and that's why I wanted to picture this. So the red dots are burned down, completely destroyed buildings. The image there is about 25 square kilometers. And so that's just one particular part of this much vaster area that was affected by this conflict, and that's the village that is the largest. And so we calculated about 3,000 huts have been burned down completely. And I just wanted to show, this is a snapshot. This is a zooming in on a smaller area of the same town. So this is inside the town. And this is a before and then after. And the same here. This is a snapshot of the town before and after. So the sort of the purple there is that those are signatures for burn evidence of burning. So it looks like the destruction was pretty much total. And the point that I wanted to make with that observation is that the amount of effort involved in doing that, and the types of weapons involved in doing that, strongly suggests that there was an intent to get rid of the people who were living in this area, and that the government would have known and should have known, and we believe did know. But instead of taking action to rein in any militias, Ali Koshaib is still at large. So in terms of our calls, advocacy calls, obviously we did call on the Sudanese authorities to fully investigate. And I should say that, in fact, the authorities in Central Darfur did come back and say, yes, we're doing an investigation. No news yet. We don't know what the result is. We hope that there are some people who are actually under investigation. We think it would be easy to arrest Ali Koshaib. He's there. He's very well known. He's actually a high-ranking commander. We've also called on the UN to take action to improve its protection capacity. In terms of, the advocacy arena, it looks bleak for all the reasons that people have stated here. It's very hard to get over the halting and divisive nature of the international response without apparent consensus, basically, on the Security Council about the role of the Sudanese government in ending abuses. But I think we would reiterate and emphasize some of the recommendations that have already been made. Sort of from a human rights point of view, we would like to see that the U.S., of course, appoint immediately the next envoy and engage in a very wide range of regional and international actors. So engaging with China would be a very key priority. Also Qatar. Qatar is sponsoring the Doha Document for Peace in Darfur, which is a basically feckless process at this point, but that's the game that is going right now. And so Qatar remains a very important advocacy target. And then other sort of typical, but important, I think, human rights recommendations, in addition to, surrendering individuals like Koshaib and also holding a process inside Darfur, a justice process inside Sudan, is for, so the United States should be pressing for those things, as well as working with regional bodies like the African Union and the League of Arab States to ensure that any political process that does emerge here includes very specific human rights and justice measures. So no symbolic, let's release a few political prisoners. Let's actually have, an accounting of how many people are still in detention and who is released. Because I think the Sudanese government has shown repeatedly that these symbolic gestures are part of its interplay. And we should be being a little more specific and demanding on what those things are. And disarming the militia and DDR type activities, of course, are part of it. So I'll stop there and thank you so much.
Oh, well, let me thank you. Let me thank all of you. Unfortunately, fortunately for you, you will not get any questions from me because I have to handle the rule on the Farm Bill at noon. I'm going to turn this over to Frank and my other colleagues. But let me just kind of just say, I was half joking, really not joking when I said maybe you should be the special envoy, or if you don't want it, maybe Ken, you could be the special envoy. If you don't want it, maybe EJ or Jahan, we go right down the line. I really do think it's time for some fresh thinking, and you have all outlined a number of things that we're not doing that I think we need to look at. But I think at this point, we don't need someone who's going to go in and kind of adhere to the status quo and be quiet and just be a figurehead. We don't need a yes man or a yes woman. We need somebody who is going to put some fresh eyes on this and maybe think out of the box. Because you've been here before. We've been sitting here before, and it's kind of the same old, and we could all say how horrified we are by the human rights violations, how horrified we are by the deaths and the killings. And maybe that makes us feel better. It's good therapy, but at the end of the day, it's not changing anything. And so we need to step it up. I hope that whoever the special envoy is somebody who will step it up, But thank you very much, and I'll yield to my friend who's been incredibly passionate on this, Mr. Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern, and I completely agree with Jim, everything he said. Fresh eyes on the target. I have a question I'm going to ask you, but my own sense is that personnel is policy. You get the right person, the policy follows. You get the wrong person, and it really isn't going to make any difference. I think we're going to know whether or not the Obama administration is successful or a failure will be on who they. Is there anyone here from the administration? Did anyone stay to listen? If you're with the administration, raise your hand. I mean, that's kind of, I mean, they didn't even stay. I mean, you would have thought they would have stayed to find some fresh, I mean, Pendergrass, how many times have you been to Sudan?
Lived and worked there in the 80s and
How many times roughly?
Probably 100.
100. And Mr. Isaac? 200. And Mr. Hogan?
Dozens.
Dozens. And
Also used to live there, dozens.
And so I think they should have stayed. And I know, let me just say, I know it's painful at times because I've had the same. I was very critical of President Bush when he went to the Beijing Olympics. I was very critical, and I'll try to find the letter when the Bush administration, remember they invited Salim Ghosh to come in. He came in a CIA plane. I criticized the administration. People say, Wolf, you know, it's your. And so I know it's kind of hard. You don't want to, but the reality is this is going to be you would have thought they would have stayed, that there would have been that one little glimpse, that one little idea that would have said, that makes sense. So I think personnel is policy. You know, I wrote down, and I think my two colleagues here, you're going to carry. I mean, when I send a letter down there, I think I might hurt the guy. I mean, I actually thought Feingold would be good. I was going to put John's name down, but I thought, you do that, I don't think they were going to hold it against me to recommend Feingold, because Feingold served with Secretary Kerry and President Bush. And so, but I thought I would put Pendergrass down. That would be a black mark against him. But you all can. You all have greater No, seriously, there are thousands, millions dying. By the 2.1 million died in North-South. Is that roughly? And how many you think died in Darfur? So we're talking about 2.5 million people. This is so. I was just writing. If personnel is policy, and John is right. I wrote John is right. Somebody break the mold. I said McGovern's right. You could put Dick Lugar. This is not a full-time job. When Danforth left, he was practicing law in St. Louis. He had a good staff. He went out there a lot, but not all the time, because you don't have to be there every day. So you could have Dick Lugar, and you could have John Pendergrass as your Washington guy, the guy who, you know, will go out more often, younger, obviously better. You know, I think Senator Lugar's probably late 70s, but he's smart, he's sharp, he understands. I think President Obama would respect him when he said he would take his calls. Secretary Kerry would take his calls. General Petraeus. General Petraeus, one of the most talented people. Ask General Petraeus to be the special envoy. He understands that region. He understands former Governor Huntsman, current Governor Sam Brownback. Sam was out there when I went to Darfur. He cares deeply. So it wouldn't take a full time. You could put your team together, a working group, the four of you. John could be the guy here to town, and I would hope both of you would call the president and ask him, because your credibility is going to be greater to listen to what they said. Everyone said, but to put somebody like that in, and the test for the president will be on who he appoints. That's going to tell you the whole story. You won't have to follow it. If it's just a person working up through the administration career, you know, can barely get in to see the secretary, it's not going to happen. That's why Danforth, I was at the appointment at Danforth. Danforth stood in the Rose Garden between President Bush and Secretary Powell. And they both literally put their hand on him. I mean, everyone knew that he was their guy. And so until it happens, it will not happen. I mean, you know, and I think, you know, Susan Rice is very good on this issue. I mean, she was very good. I mean, you guys ought to call Susan Rice and ask her. But this is going to be the real test. of this administration. And quite frankly, all the students out there who were having hope for President Obama, this is going to be a test. If you have the bumper sticker, Obama, 2012, and then you have the other one, stop the genocide in Darfur, yeah, this is the test, because we can't go on. There are going to be a whole generation of people that will never manage to survive after the next 2, 3, or 4 years. This is really so. I have a number of questions I was going to ask you. Who would you think would be good? But I don't think I should do that, because you might actually hurt the person or say something. But I think you ought to be in touch with people that you know to give your ideas of who you think it ought to be, so that they're able to and offer to have you all four and other people like you to be sort of a team that sort of meets on a weekly basis or on a monthly basis to sort of strategize. But I think what John said. The other thing is, I thought it was wrong to invite Ghosh here, and I may be wrong, so my position could be wrong. Do you think it's a good idea to have, and hopefully it'll never take place now, do you think it's a good idea to have Nafi Ali Nafi to come to Washington? I'm not saying never talk to him, not in Ethiopia, not in Addis Ababa, not in Juba. I'm not talking about that, not in Nairobi, but in Washington. Do you think he should be invited to Washington? Mr. Isaacs, do you think he should be invited here to Washington?
Yeah, absolutely not. It's reprehensible. He has a lot of murder and blood on his hands. I can't even believe that he would be brought here. I can't even believe it would be considered.
Mr. Hagan, do you think he should be invited here?
I think we should talk to whomever we need to get a peace deal in Sudan. And I would just like to point out that Nafi Ali Nafi signed the last almost agreement that would have prevented the war in Blue Nile and southern Kordofan.
So you would invite him to Washington?
I think, we talked to lots of bad people. We've talked to lots of bad people in the past.
No, I said we didn't. The talking to him is not the issue. We can talk to him in Addis Ababa. We can talk to him in Juba. We can talk to him in Switzerland. We can talk to him in Nairobi. That's where, if you're the north-south, most of the conversation. I'm talking about, do you think it's a good idea to invite him here to Washington? I'm not talking about talking. I don't have any problem talking. But would you invite him to Washington? Yes or no? It's okay if you think it's okay. I just want you. So you're a yes.
Yes.
Put you down
like
a yes.
I said,
okay, good.
I think we need to make some. I think this is an extremely complicated problem.
Good. That's
There are no
fine.
easy
Good. I
decisions
agree.
to make.
I appreciate it. Do you think you should invite him to Washington?
I have to say that my organization's mandate would not weigh in on that question.
Okay.
But I think it does send a negative message.
I think with that, I would just kind of end. I would hope we're all watching, and I'm disappointed that the administration didn't keep somebody here to listen. And again, to my colleagues, Steny Hoyer, Chris Smith, and a group of us spoke out very strongly when Milosevic, who was and Karadzic were involved in the genocide in the former Yugoslavia, in Vukovar and Srebrenica, and the very thought that people would have allowed Milosevic or Karadzic to travel to other, I mean, it would have never happened. And I think it pretty much, the West is saying, we do not value the life of somebody in Sudan the same way that we value someone in Europe. If all this were taking place in villages in southern Italy or southern Germany, the world would be up. And here it just, so I just think with that I'll just kind of end and thank all of you for your work and effort and the time and the effort. And I think you would be a great team, and hopefully we'll see that the president will appoint someone like a Dick Lugar or a General Petraeus, and then work with the four of you and like-minded people like that to sort of be the team, the advising team. Iron sharpens iron. I think it's good that you said yes, because that's not necessarily bad. You want people that are going to speak the truth, really say what they really think, be willing to take an idea that at first is a little bit afraid of, but to do everything it possibly can to bring a peace. So what, in 2 or 3 years, you know, there is peace. And the last thing I wrote out here, I said both Khartoum and Juba could prosper. With the oil and the minerals there, the people of Khartoum, the Sudan could prosper, and the people of Southern Sudan could prosper, and they could have an amazing 2 countries living in peace. And if we can just resolve this issue. So with that, I just thank you for your testimony. I yield to the gentlelady from Maryland.
Thank you. And I think there are a number of areas, Mr. Wolf in particular, especially when it comes to Sudan, where we've been on the same page and trying to communicate the same message to this administration as we did to the Bush administration. I want to thank the witnesses today because you outlined some very, very precise things that the United States could do. And I hope you won't mind if we take your testimony and plagiarize those, outlining some of those same things to the administration under our own letterhead. And I do think it's worth it if people have ideas about the appointment of an envoy, that we could figure out a way that we would share that with the administration. And I agree with Mr. Wolf. I think it matters very much the who, because that will say as much as anything about our commitment in the process. And so that's just a word to the administration. Each of you in your testimony outlining sort of more precise things that we could do. And one of the things that strikes me is that, I don't really see, you know, I was sitting here with Mr. Tierney and asking myself, and, you know, I'm, you know, not the brightest bulb, but what is the difference between Assad and al-Bashir? And what then explains one response one place and another response another place? I don't understand those things, and so I'm hoping that I can try to understand them. You know, I feel like we keep visiting over and over again, you know, the escalating human crisis. And I suppose we could wait another 6 months and then we'd add another 100,000 or so people to the list who've been, you know, impacted, killed, displaced. But we've been doing that just over and over again. So it makes me wonder, and I think, Ms. Henry, in your testimony, it seems like the Sudanese leaders kind of agree to one thing as a way to get to the next hurdle, but they never really fulfill those agreements. And in fact, it is just precisely to get to the next place. So then there's another mini negotiation, and then they get to the next place. But the killing and the displacement and the bombing and the destruction just goes on. And so it's not really clear to me what agreement we could actually reach with them. And I, share the concerns about, talking to as many people as possible to come to a resolution. But it makes me wonder how much we'd ever really be able to count on a resolution from Khartoum. Those are just my own thoughts. As to Ali Nafi, I have to tell you, we have negotiations and discussions, for example, that are going on with the Taliban, but they don't get to visit Washington. And so there is a difference in the message that conveys, both to those who struggle for their independence and freedom and safety, as well as to the rest of the world. And there are a lot of bad guys around the world, and we have to figure out ways that we deal with those bad guys in an effort to move toward peace. But one of the things I think you don't do is to give them the kind of legitimacy. Even though we do want to have those conversations, you don't give them that kind of legitimacy. And those are just my thoughts as one member of Congress. I don't really have any other questions, I think that you outlined in your testimony with some precision where it is that that a direction that we could go that would be a direction forward, and we're going to take that to mind. Mr. Isaacs, even though this is the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, there are a couple of things that you outlined that might not fall in the purview of this commission, but very interesting, I would say. So, and with that, I'll conclude, and I guess we'll yield to Mr. Tierney.
Well, thank all of you for your testimony on that. Mr. Prendergast, you and I go back to a subcommittee hearing on national security and foreign affairs that we had, years ago on this, and here we are again. That was Darfur, and I congratulate you on staying with us. I do all of you. You've been very persistent on this. I don't have a lot of questions, and I would basically adopt a lot of things that were said by Mr. Wolf, who's done a great job of this. Frank, I want to thank you, and Jimmy McGovern, obviously, as well as Donna Edwards on this. But so just so I missed the very early part of it, though I started when John was testifying on that. So everybody should know what other country is giving Bashir the backbone to stand up and be as cruel as he's doing. Who's not on board with doing something about him? Is it China still, essentially?
Respond, but China has had long-standing commercial deals with these guys, so of course they're going to, just like we would for Saudi Arabia, and they're going to be supportive of their commercial ally. The Russians have sold a great deal of arms, and they're invested a bit in the oil support services sector. And European Union has largely been supportive of negotiations, but not terribly supportive of the agenda to try to escalate pressure on this regime for the kind of things that they've done. So the Arab League has been, of course, not very helpful in terms of trying to move the regime or pressure the regime to make compromises. So my view would be that we often find ourselves alone or with only a few other countries when we're standing on principle.
So there's no international organization that's going to join in the fray on a principled issue like this, talking about what's happening in atrocities.
One quick thing, they'll support the negotiations process, but
so the endless jibber jabbering back and forth.
And it's been a very confused one, because as you even saw from the before you came, the administration's witness said we support a comprehensive peace process in Sudan, which is where this idea that it's all got to be together. But they also support the individual peace process for Darfur, individual peace process for the New Mountains Blue Nile, and one for the Eastern Sudan. It just divides the place. So, this is the confusion. It's very troubling that our State Department, entrusted with our diplomatic effort, seems to not have a basic cohesion about the very part of the policy that they're supposed to be leading on, and so it's been of course it's resulted in the kind of failure that
which obviously begs for an envoy who's got some insight and some ability and
stature,
so
they can take a stand on some of these things.
So I don't want to belabor the point. Obviously, the international community has taken a pass. They're all involved in a lot of other places, and they're not doing what begs to be done here on that. So, Frank, you're right. We need to talk with the administration and try and weigh in on that for whatever value it's going to have, just as we did the last time. I thank all of you. You've brought this matter to the forefront yet again, and I think Frank also may be right. The young people of this country don't generally like to see something like this continue on or whatever, and I know we did a lot of work bringing their voice into the mixture last time. I can remember there were children out there with putting their pennies towards trying to make sure the people in Darfur had food and some subsistence or anything like that, and maybe we just can't stop doing that type of thing, and it just has to be persistent. So thank you all. I appreciate it.
We're going to end. I just want to ask you the last question. What is your own opinion, since you're not recommending, because I think, John, you covered it when you used the word stature, of a Lugar or a Petraeus?
I think Senator Lugar would be fantastic. I mean, I think having that stature. But let me just say, tied to enhancement of policy. Because if you send the greatest diplomat in human history without a change in the policy and upgrade and understanding that we have to get more deeply engaged with civil society, opposition, and the rebel movements and figure out how we can help them become a more credible interlocutor so that potentially a peace process can come to fruition if we ever have it, or we can hasten the day where democracy comes to Sudan.
Isaacs?
I'm not prepared to say who I might think a good envoy would be, but I'd like to read a quote to you. Every government has a responsibility to protect its citizens, and any government that brutalizes and massacres its people does not deserve to govern. Barack Obama, February 2012. And when I heard that, I thought, wow, if the President of the United States would just say that about Sudan, who has killed, I believe, more than 3 million people, and it goes on. But I agree with what John says. I always defer to John.
Second, any thought about Senator Lugar or General Petraeus?
Well, we don't have a dog in this fight, so to speak, but I mean, I certainly think it should be a very senior figure. But I should also say it's a full-time position. I respect Mr. Danforth and what he was able to achieve, but the world is very, very different from what it was in early 2000. I think that the diplomatic challenges are much more severe. The United States doesn't lead on Sudan policy anymore. It needs to work with a lot of different partners, and it's herding cats. It is a full-time job that's going to require the entire administration pushing in the same direction on the same priorities, and unfortunately that hasn't happened in the past.
I don't agree that it's a full-time job. I think you need a full-time staff, like people like John and a group of others, but and America could lead, and I think what Danforth did, because he had the credibility, that gave him the ability to do more than a full-time person who didn't have that credibility. And lastly, I think it was more difficult to end the North-South war than we are now. The oil wasn't involved. There were a lot of other activities. So my sense is Danforth or Petraeus working with a team could do it. But we disagree. So what would your reaction be? I know you're not position taken, but Petraeus or a senator.
Right. No, I don't have names. I mean, I would basically echo what my colleague here just said about the need for it to be a very high-profile person, and also the herding cats quality of the work. I mean, I think it's really obvious that there are so many actors across different regions who are really important. We have allies, friendly countries that are actually having very unfriendly policies towards Sudan as well, in the European Union, for example. And there's a whole lot of work to be done. So that's where I...
Mr. Wolf, I would just say, and this is for all of us to take away, I think John's point that whether the person who's the envoy is a high profile or a low profile, if it's not tied to policy and to changing policy, it's doomed to failure, and that's where we are right now. And so I would hope we would take that as a marker going forward, and I thank all the witnesses.
I agree. What Senator Danforth did, he helped to develop the policy, and he had the credibility. When Danforth would call President Bush took the call. When Senator Danforth would call Secretary Powell, also when Danforth went out in the region, the people out in the region knew. So he really kind of developed the policy working with Secretary Powell. But I think you're right. If you have the right person with the wrong policy, but I think bringing the right person in can help fashion a policy. Anyway, I thank you very much, and hearing's adjourned.